I spotted him from across the street, hunched over like the weight of every bad choice he'd ever made was pressing down on his shoulders, dragging his feet through the gutter as he rummaged through overflowing trash bags for anything he could sell. I never thought I'd see my ex-husband like this again, reduced to digging through garbage just to eat, his once strong frame now thin and frail, his clothes ragged and stained, his hair wild and gray. My breath caught in my throat. Everything around me blurred, the cars rushing by, the people hurrying past, until all I could see was him, bent over a pile of discarded bottles and cans, stuffing the redeemable ones into a torn plastic bag. I had just come out of the grocery store, bags in my hands, when I noticed him there on the corner of Elm and Fifth, invisible to everyone else. My heart slammed against my ribs. This was the man I had built a life with, the man I had loved fiercely, the man who walked out one day and left me shattered. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever felt that kind of shock or pain, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. I have more stories like this to share, stories that might help you feel less alone. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, unable to move. Memories flooded back without warning. The day he vanished, the short note he left on the kitchen table. "I'm sorry, this is the only way." No explanation, no goodbye. Just those words and an emptiness that swallowed me whole for years. I went through anger, disbelief, grief that never quite lifted. And now, after all this time, here he was, scraping the bottom of life, while I had finally pieced something together for myself. Part of me wanted to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen him, to protect the fragile peace I'd built. But something deeper pulled me forward. My shoes clicked on the pavement as I crossed the street. He must have heard me because he lifted his head slowly, and when our eyes met, recognition hit him like a punch. His face went pale beneath the dirt. His hands shook as he dropped a crushed can. "You shouldn't be seeing me like this," he muttered, voice rough and low, turning his face away. "Just go, Veronica. Forget you saw anything." I didn't move. I couldn't. I stepped closer, taking in the cracked skin on his hands, the hollow cheeks, the eyes that used to look at me with so much warmth, now dulled by exhaustion and shame. "What happened to you, David?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. "After everything, you owe me an answer." He pressed his lips together, glancing around like someone might be watching. Then he shook his head. "You were never supposed to know," he whispered. "I made sure of that." I moved even closer. The smell hit me. Sweat, street grime, despair. "Made sure of what?" I demanded. "You left me with nothing. Debts I didn't understand. A house foreclosed. Years of scraping by. Tell me why." He looked up then, eyes glistening. "To keep you breathing," he said quietly. "That's why." The words knocked the air out of me. My knees felt weak. "What are you talking about?" He swayed slightly, and I reached out instinctively, grabbing his arm to steady him. His body gave way, collapsing against me as he passed out cold on the filthy sidewalk. I screamed for help. A few people stopped. Someone called 911. I knelt beside him, cradling his head the way I used to when he came home exhausted from work years ago. Only now, he wasn't just tired, he was broken. The ambulance came fast. The paramedics said severe dehydration, malnutrition, early signs of organ strain. At the hospital, they told me he'd been in and out of shelters, no ID, refusing most help. When he finally awoke hours later, the first thing he said was, "Go home, Veronica. You don't belong here." I stayed in the chair beside his bed. "I'm not leaving until you tell me everything." He closed his eyes, jaw tight. After a long silence, he spoke so soft I had to lean in. "Everything I gave up so you'd stay safe," he said, "and you hated me for it." "I didn't know," I whispered. I thought you just walked away.
That's exactly what I needed you to think. In that moment, I realized I'd spent years resenting a man who might have been protecting me all along. I didn't know from what yet, but the need to understand burned inside me. I took his hand gently. Rest now. You're not doing this alone anymore. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift, like the start of answers I wasn't sure I was ready for. David slept most of the next day, pumped full of fluids and nutrients his body hadn't seen in too long. I stayed by his bed, watching the monitors beep steadily, letting memories surface that I'd buried deep. We met when I was 29. He was 34, a civil engineer with big dreams and steady hands. He worked long hours on city infrastructure projects, but always came home with a smile for me. We bought a modest house in the suburbs, talked about kids that never came, built a life that felt solid. I managed the house, worked part-time at a local accounting firm, stretched every dollar. We argued sometimes, money was tight, stress was high, but we always made up. I never imagined he'd disappear without a fight. One Tuesday morning in October 2017, he kissed me goodbye like always and left for work. He never came home. I called his office, his cell, his friends. Nothing. On the third day, a process server showed up with divorce papers and a short, handwritten note. "Forgive me. Don't look for me." The accounts were drained. Creditors started calling about loans I'd never heard of. Within a year, the house was gone, savings wiped out, my credit destroyed. I moved into a tiny apartment, took cleaning jobs, started over at 48. People whispered that I must have driven him away. I let them talk because I didn't have answers. Sitting in that hospital room, the old anger cracked open. When David woke again, I asked the nurse to give us privacy. I closed the door softly. "Tell me all of it," I said. "No more half-truths." He stared at the ceiling for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "The day I left, I was supposed to disappear forever, or worse." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He said, "I was told to take the fall for something I didn't do. When I refused at first, they made it clear you'd pay if I didn't cooperate." "Who are they?" He swallowed hard. "People with power, contractors, city officials, men who move millions and erase anyone in their way. I signed papers I shouldn't have, under pressure. When I realized the bids were rigged, the money diverted, I wanted to report it. That night they came to me with photos of you, leaving work, grocery shopping, walking alone. They said it could all look like an accident if I didn't play along." I felt cold spread through me. "So you took the blame?" He said, "I accepted everything," he said bitterly. "Signed over assets, let them paint me as the corrupt one, made it look like I'd gambled everything away, run off with debts. You had to believe I was guilty so you wouldn't dig, so they'd know the threat worked." I covered my mouth, tears coming fast. All those years I struggled, cleaning offices, skipping meals, was because of them? "And because of me," he said, voice breaking. "I thought if I vanished completely, they'd leave you alone. I lived rough on purpose, kept moving, no ID, no trace, so they'd see I was keeping my end." Why not come back once it was over? Because it was never over. They kept tabs. Every time I got close to stable, something reminded me you were only safe if I stayed gone. I cried quietly, holding his hand. The hate I'd carried for so long turned into something heavier, grief for what we'd both lost. That night, walking the hospital corridors, I rewrote every memory. The foreclosure notice dated November 12, 2017. The bank statement showing a $47,200 withdrawal I never authorized. The collection calls about a $28,000 credit line in my name alone. All engineered. The next morning, I was different. "I'm not letting this stay buried," I told him. He looked alarmed. Don't stir it up. They're dangerous. So is silence, I said. I've lived it for years. He gripped the sheet. You don't know what you're starting. I know what they took, I replied, and I'm done paying for it. That same day, 2 men in suits lingered too long in the waiting area, asking about a patient that didn't exist. David saw them through the door glass and went pale. They're already here, he whispered. I felt fear, real and sharp, but also something stronger. If he'd become invisible to save me, I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. The hospital no longer felt safe. Every footsteps in the hall made me tense. David's confession had turned me from a bystander into a target. That night, while he slept fitfully, I sat in the dim light thinking about everything I'd endured after he left. The eviction, the nights I ate plain rice so the bills could be paid, the shame of asking family for help. All of it staged, all of it deliberate. At first light, I went back to his room. He was awake, eyes worried. I'm still here, I said before he could speak. He nodded, relieved. Then I sat close. I need names, real ones. He closed his eyes tight. Some names kill you just for knowing them. My life was already at risk, I said. You just made sure I didn't know it. He took a shaky breath. It started with the Riverside Bridge Project, $82 million contract in 2016. I was senior engineer. Bids came in rigged. Shell companies, kickbacks, materials skimmed. When I found the paper trail, I copied everything. That night, a man I'd never seen before waited outside our house, showed me your photo taken that morning, said accidents happen to wives who ask too many questions. I remembered that week, I'd felt watched, but thought it was stress. He continued, I tried to resign quietly, they wouldn't let me, needed a fall guy with a clean record. I was perfect. When I still resisted, they upped the threat, said they'd make it look like you overdosed or got mugged. I signed everything they wanted, transferred assets to accounts they controlled, let them leak stories about my gambling problem, left so you'd hate me and stay far from the truth. And the money? I asked. The house? Part of the price had to look real. They even forged your signature on some loans. Invoice number 2016-447B, $38,900, dated October 3, 2017. So if anyone dug, we'd both look guilty. I felt sick. My name used to launder their crimes. Why stay gone so long? They checked in. Every few years, someone would find me, remind me you were alive only because I behaved. I kept moving, shelters, streets, odd jobs for cash, became a ghost. I squeezed his hand until my knuckles went white. No more ghosts. He looked terrified. If we open this, people die. Then let's make sure it's them, not us. That afternoon, a doctor pulled me aside. We've had unusual visitors asking about your friend. Be careful. I nodded, heart racing. Back in the room, I told David, we need that evidence you saved. His eyes widened. You can't. I already decided I can. He hesitated, then gave in. Old storage unit on Carver Street, Unit 19, false back wall in the far corner, lock code 0824, our anniversary month and year. I kissed his forehead. I'll be careful. That night, I barely slept. Every shadow felt alive. The next morning, I rented a car, drove to the rundown facility on the edge of town. The place smelled of mildew and old oil. Unit 19 was jammed with dusty boxes, things we'd stored before the foreclosure. I moved them, found the false panel, pried it open. Inside was a locked metal case. Code worked. Inside, flash drives, folders, printed contracts, photos of meetings, bank records, everything. My hands shook as I packed it into a nondescript backpack. As I left, a dark sedan idled across the street. Engine started when I did. I took a winding route, stopped at a crowded mall, waited inside a store until it was gone. Back at the hospital, I slipped the bag under David's bed. He saw my face and knew. You got it. I nodded. Now they'll know we have it.
He closed his eyes. Then we're out of time. Let them come, I said. This time I'm ready. I hid copies of the drives in a safe deposit box at a small bank 40 miles away, box 312, registered under a maiden name variation no one knew. The originals stayed with me in a locked briefcase. I started making quiet calls. An old friend who'd become a reporter, a retired detective I'd met years ago. I showed only fragments, enough to prove it was real. The reporter, Clara, met me in a quiet diner. She flipped through scanned pages I'd printed. "This is huge," she whispered. "City council members, contractors worth hundreds of millions? If this holds, heads will roll." "I already took everything from us," I said. "Time they paid." She agreed to help, carefully. We moved slowly, digital copies encrypted, physical ones scattered. David's health seesawed. Some days he was lucid, others feverish. Doctors said years of malnutrition had taken a permanent toll. One evening he gripped my hand hard. "If I don't make it, promise you'll finish this." "You're going to see it," I told him fiercely. But fear gnawed at me. Strange cars parked near my apartment, hang-up calls, a brick through my window one night with a note, "Stop digging." I didn't stop. Clara connected me to a federal investigator who'd been watching the same players for years but lacked hard evidence. We met in a park at dawn. I handed over one drive. He scanned it on a laptop right there. Face went grim. "This ties together 3 open cases," he said. "We can move fast if you testify." "I will." That afternoon, a doctor pulled me aside. "We've had unusual visitors asking about your friend. Be careful." I nodded, heart racing. Back in the room, I told David, "We need that evidence you saved." His eyes widened. "You can't." "I already decided I can." He hesitated, then gave in. "Old storage unit on Carver Street, Unit 19, false back wall in the far corner. Lock code 0824, our anniversary month and year." I kissed his forehead. "I'll be careful." That night I barely slept. Every shadow felt alive. The next morning I rented a car, drove to the run-down facility on the edge of town. The place smelled of mildew and old oil. Unit 19 was jammed with dusty boxes, things we'd stored before the foreclosure. I moved them, found the false panel, pried it open. Inside was a locked metal case. Code worked. Inside, flash drives, folders, printed contracts, photos of meetings, bank records, everything. My hands shook as I packed it into a nondescript backpack. As I left, a dark sedan idled across the street. Engine started when I did. I took a winding route, stopped at a crowded mall, waited inside a store until it was gone. Back at the hospital, I slipped the bag under David's bed. He saw my face and knew. "You got it." I nodded. "Now they'll know we have it." He closed his eyes. "Then we're out of time." "Let them come," I said. "This time I'm ready." I hid copies of the drives in a safe deposit box at a small bank 40 miles away, box 312, registered under a maiden name variation no one knew. The originals stayed with me in a locked briefcase. I started making quiet calls. An old friend who'd become a reporter, a retired detective I'd met years ago. I showed only fragments, enough to prove it was real. The reporter, Clara, met me in a quiet diner. She flipped through scanned pages I'd printed. "This is huge," she whispered. "City council members, contractors worth hundreds of millions? If this holds, heads will roll." I said, "They already took everything from us. Time they paid." She agreed to help, carefully. We moved slowly, digital copies encrypted, physical ones scattered. David's health seesawed. Some days he was lucid, others feverish. Doctors said years of malnutrition had taken a permanent toll. One evening he gripped my hand hard. "If I don't make it, promise you'll finish this." "You're going to see it," I told him fiercely. But fear gnawed at me. Strange cars parked near my apartment, hang-up calls, a brick through my window one night with a note, "Stop digging." I didn't stop. Clara connected me to a federal investigator who'd been watching the same players for years but lacked hard evidence. We met in a park at dawn. I handed over one drive. He scanned it on a laptop right there. Face went grim. "This ties together 3 open cases," he said. "We can move fast if you testify." "I will."
But his body was too worn. One quiet afternoon, he slipped away peacefully while I held his hand. "I kept my promise," I whispered. "They know the truth now." He squeezed my fingers once, faintly, then let go. The funeral was small, just me, a few old friends, the reporter, the investigator, no media. I buried him with the wedding ring he'd still worn under his ragged clothes. Afterward, the state held a formal acknowledgement. They read his name, apologized for the injustice, presented me with a folder of cleared records and reparations. I accepted quietly. Money rebuilt a life, but it didn't rebuild the years. I bought a small house near the coast, nothing grand, just light-filled rooms and a porch overlooking the ocean. I placed our wedding photo on a shelf, not hidden, not center stage, just there. Some days the loss still hits hard. I walk the beach and talk to him in my head, telling him about the trials, the sentences, the changes in city contracting laws that bear his name in footnotes. I learned to live gently, morning coffee on the porch, long walks collecting shells, volunteering at a women's shelter, helping others rebuild after ruin. One morning, sorting old papers, I found a letter he'd hidden in the evidence box, his handwriting shaky from the streets. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't mourn the man who disappeared. Remember the one who loved you enough to carry the darkness alone. You were always my light. Live in it now." I cried until I couldn't anymore, then folded the letter and kept it close. Today, I wake without fear. I no longer scan crowds for threats. I sleep deeply. I forgive him completely, not that there was anything left to forgive. I live for both of us now, quietly, fully, freely, because he gave me the greatest gift, my life, and I honor it by living without chains. If this story moved you, if you've ever carried pain you didn't understand, or found strength you didn't know you had, please share your own experience in the comments below. I read every one, and they mean the world to me. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories of survival and truth, subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the next one. You're not alone.